Hello, everyone. Max Carrier here, one of the co-hosts. Quick message before we dive into today's episode. If you've been enjoying the show, please rate and review us on Apple and Spotify. Also, consider sharing this podcast with your climbing friends. Word of mouth is a powerful tool to help us out. You can also check us out and engage with us on social media. We are at the.climbing.majority. With that housekeeping out of the way, we can get into today's episode. In today's episode, we have a conversation with Harvey. Harvey is a climber, musician, and hairdresser from Vancouver BC. Harvey was the recent subject of a full-length documentary film called Crux, which follows Harvey's journey navigating addiction to drugs and alcohol and trying to balance sobriety in life and finding climbing in the process. I highly recommend watching this documentary and go follow Harvey at Harvey. In today's conversation, we do a deep dive into mental health, addiction, and drugs and alcohol consumption. We talk about the hypocrisy of the pharmaceutical industry, and we cover topics such as abstinence versus harm reduction. And we hope that this conversation will help reduce the negative stigmatization around drugs and alcohol and give insight into what it's like for those who struggle with these and similar issues. As always, we hope you enjoy today's conversation.
Mountains outside.
Nice.
Yeah.
Hell yeah.
Sweet, man. Yeah.
Well, awesome.
How are y'all?
Well, yeah, really good, man. We were just sharing stories about the crazy life of adventure and climbing, highlining, and risk.
Just shooting the shit.
Shooting the shit as a climber.
Nice.
Have you ever highlined before?
No. I've seen some big ones on the Squamish Chief, but I've tried being on a slack line, but I can barely stand on one.
Yeah, dude,
I
so
second
hard.
that, man. I'm terrible. I went up to the Chief one time and I saw Spencer Seabrook. Do you know who he is, Harvey?
It sounds familiar, but
he's like pretty, I don't know if famous would be the right word, but like he's like, I would say famous actually. So he's the guy, I forget which area on the Chief, but they set up a slack line from the Chief, like all the way across the gully, I think, or it's across one of the peaks. And he did the slack line solo without a tether. So it's like massive high line, right? And he did it untethered. You can get the video actually on YouTube. So anyone listening,
I was climbing Angel's Crest one day, and they had it going from I guess the second peak all the way to the third, or it was like the biggest gap that you can do, basically.
Totally.
It looked fucking humongous.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. You guys know the logistical standpoint of rigging something that long? Do they have to like helicopter the ends to one side, or like how do they do it?
My assumption is you're getting like a really thin tag line that's like so long that's like attached to that, and you're gonna rig one end and then walk with the tag line all the way.
I'm sure it's super heavy.
I'm sure
so you probably
someone
gotta crank it on one side at a certain point. But taglines make sense.
Yeah, probably. But yeah, that's interesting. That's a whole nother devil.
Yeah, the
bow and arrow, like some wily shit,
like a little plunger on the end. Oh man, that's a good picture in my mind. That'll live there rent free. Yeah, well, sweet, man, dude. Stoked we got you here. You know, what happened to you the other day? Were you sick or what was going on?
I had a long night.
Gotcha.
I wasn't doing very good. I felt
man.
really bad bailing, but to be honest, I just wasn't in the space to talk.
No, man, that's all good.
I think I made the right choice in the end, and feeling ready to talk now.
Dude, that's all good. We're happy to have you here. Yeah. Well, I mean, like, you know, we're here. We're good. I'm good to start if everybody else is here. So, you know, in general, I think we can just start off with you, you know, introducing like who you are and, you know, telling us a little bit about yourself and going from there.
Yeah, my name's Harvey Wright. I'm 34 years old. I live in Canada, in Vancouver BC. Um, got into climbing a few years ago, and it's been a pretty transformative activity in my life. And I was lucky enough to be a part of a film that was made a couple years ago, sort of about that process. And that's why I'm here talking to you today, I guess.
Yeah, for sure, man. Yeah, definitely. I think a little later on, we'll probably jump into that process of Crux and everything like that, and talk about that for the viewers. But if we can just start off maybe with you giving us like a brief overview of were you born in BC? What was growing up for you like, and just a little bit of dip into your past and your history.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up all over Canada, actually. My dad was in the military, in and out of the military. So I was actually born in New Brunswick, and then I lived in Edmonton, and then I lived in Saskatchewan, all before the age of 6. And then when I was 6, we moved from Saskatchewan to Calgary. And I guess that's what I consider to be my hometown, because I lived there till I was 16, so about 9 years. Spent my last couple of years of high school in Oshawa, Ontario, if anyone knows where that is. As soon as I graduated, moved out to BC, and I've been here ever since. So my whole adult life has been coastal BC. And I'd say I really got my first taste and I think enjoyment of the outdoors and the mountains living in Calgary, being close to Banff. And yeah.
Real quick, how does one live in and out military?
My dad was in the military from the time I was born till about the time I was 6, and then he left, and he actually rejoined the military after I'd moved away from home. But yeah.
Okay, so there was a pretty large gap in between his service dates.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Cool. And
he was a chaplain.
A chaplain. Okay.
Yeah. Preacher
Nice.
man.
Crazy.
Preacher man in the military. Yeah, it's gotta have it.
Yeah.
Second question. What was your academic life like? Were you an academic student? Were you a partier? What kind of student were you at that time in your life?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of breezed through school always. I was talented in music mostly, and my mom was a music teacher, not in school but privately, and a choral singer and a piano player, and so music was kind of always my thing. And I liked school, but I never really took it seriously, I guess you could say. I loved the social aspect of it. I played football for a few years, which was fun. But yeah, I kind of got into the partying pretty young. And I would say that was more of my focus through those school years more than academia. I didn't go to university, learned how to be a hairdresser when I was 18, pretty much just after graduating high school. And I'm still cutting hair today. But, I kind of chose that path because I didn't really know what I would have wanted to do if I was to go to post-secondary. I was into fashion, I was into photography, I was also into music. I thought about maybe taking a, music production course or a fashion design course, but I was never really good at drawing. So I thought that would be a hindrance to being a fashion designer. And I don't know. But that's kind of what got me into hair. I wanted to be around people and art and that kind of thing. And so I found a way to do that through cutting people's hair.
Super cool, man. I think I really resonate with you when you're talking about thinking about post-secondary and not, knowing what to do. For myself, I had a terrible experience going through high school, and I dropped out of school in grade 9, and, wow. I redid my dogwood. So the high school equivalency graduation, just graduated that a year ago now, at 27. And so I think it's really interesting going to school, and there's a lot of 18-year-old kids in some of the classes and stuff. And it's really interesting, the thought process of like being 18 and making decisions for the rest of your life and knowing exactly what you want. You know, I think that's a really bizarre thing. And when I look back at myself when I was 18, you know, I think I'd have some interesting words for myself, to say the least. But I didn't know what I wanted to do. So yeah, I just think that's a really interesting thing that our society's put upon people. And I know some people who are just like, you know, they knew what they wanted to do. They're a bullet train and they went off. But I think for the vast majority of people, that's really requires a little bit more of a journey to get into and to find what you actually want to do. Right.
Yeah. And like a decision that's going to cost you like $100,000 as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
Like, yeah.
Yeah. I was in kind of the opposite boat. I was just kind of like, school came really easy. I was very academic focused, super socially awkward. You know, my school was a student body of 400 in entire high school. So everybody knew each other's business. It was like a nerdy school, charter school. And I look back and I'm super grateful for that, because I learned a lot in terms of just being, you know, educated. But after that, you know, I was trying to get in the military path. I tried to go to the Air Force Academy and got denied, but they offered me a full ride scholarship instead to a local college, which I took. And then I did that for a year, and I just hated the college experience. I felt like I was wasting my time. The military for me just like did not resonate with how I was wanting to live my life. And so I took a freshman opportunity, what they called it, the freshman op, where you could leave college the first year without any consequences or without any debt. And so I took that opportunity and left, and kind of just started to forge my own path. And my life went down the drain for a couple of years while I tried to figure that out. But yeah, it's just funny, you know, you guys seemed like you guys threw yourself into this kind of like forge your own path, kind of figure out what you guys want to do pretty early on. And it took me a long time to get to that place. I was definitely on track to like following those cookie cutter steps of the typical, you know, white family American going to college, or, you know, the military life. There was just a point where I was just like, no, I can't do this. I need to figure it out on my own. And yeah, I paid the price for a couple of years, but I'm happy I did.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally, man. You know, so I guess for anyone listening here, like obviously it'll be in the intro, but you know, today we're here to talk about essentially like mental health, drug abuse, drug addiction, you know, sport. Those are kind of the topics that we're looking to cover today. And you know, Harvey, you've got quite an interesting story, obviously. So you know, I've got some things laid out here, but I think just given the way things are going, it makes a little bit more sense to actually just dive into talking about Crux a little bit. You know, so for anybody who doesn't know, Harvey was a part of a project called Crux. And so why don't you just take it from there, Harvey, and let us know a little bit about that project and how that came about.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I'll just start with kind of the story of how I got into climbing. And it's a little bit of a doozy, but might as well start from the beginning.
Sure, man.
You know, as I just described, I was kind of pretty into partying when I was younger. That sort of guided my life up until my late 20s. And you know, I definitely, you know, drinking, drugging, DJing a lot, late nights, like I just said, partying guided my life. And it definitely came with its hardships and its struggles. But up until the end of my 20s, it was still what I wanted to be doing, I guess. It was pretty fun, but by the end of my 20s, after numerous rock bottoms, and specifically a few really bad injuries, car accident, bicycle accident that nearly killed me, a broken leg, the end of a marriage, I found myself at 28 years old really, really, really in a bad place and really unhappy with my life. And I was on the mend from these injuries, and I ended up seeing some climbing films. And I just thought, I saw these people in these climbing films and thought, wow, that just looks amazing. Like these people are doing something pretty rad with their life that looks meaningful and stimulating and exciting. And so I'll skip kind of through some stuff, but essentially dove right into climbing and found myself within a couple of years of that actually, really participating in the sport in a pretty big way, a way that I never really expected. And I started working at Patagonia, and one of my coworkers there was a budding photographer and filmmaker. And our other friend, he was looking to make a film, and our other friend was like, you should make a film about Harvey. He's got a kind of a pretty crazy story. And they were like, yeah, okay. And so originally it was just going to end up being sort of a 10-minute YouTube spotlight of, here's Harvey, this is what he does. And when I had started climbing, I basically went from being in the throes of total powerless addiction to starting to climb and cold turkey sober. And like I said, it absolutely revolutionized my life. And the idea for the film came about in this part of my life that was sober, happy, very, in a pretty good place. And the idea for the film was going to sort of be like, here's where I was, and I found this cool thing called climbing, and I started doing it, and here's where I am now. And we applied for a grant through the Vancouver International Mountain Film Festival that's supported by Arc'teryx. And we ended up winning the grant to make the film, so it turned into something bigger than a 10-minute movie. And that was basically, we got the go-ahead to make a feature-length film about 2 months before the pandemic landed. And the pandemic happened and drama ensued. And so the film, without giving too much of it away, not that, I can do that, captures my life in real time, essentially, through 2020. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
and thereafter.
When Max told me about the film, I immediately just jumped and watched it. And I mean, not only was it just super well shot, like we spoke before, it definitely, like you said, told the story in lifetime because you guys were in the middle of shooting this. And for anybody that hasn't watched it, I highly, highly recommend it. Really, really awesome. Really cool story, super unique, and just really well shot. If like you said, you don't need to give too much of it away. You definitely want to drive people to watch it because it's absolutely worth it.
Yeah, it's a very, very powerful film, and I think very, very needed, and obviously a really different take on what climbing is and what climbing can mean to somebody, and using sport as an outlet, right? Yeah. So so I guess like with that in mind, like if we can just dive into some of the nitty and gritty of some things here is like, I guess, you said you started partying really early. Like, what is early for you?
Probably about 13 or 14.
And
yeah.
What do you think like gravitated you towards that?
I was a really joyous and excited and happy kid. I actually just had a visit with my mom, and she had kind of reminded me of that. Pretty happy-go-lucky, still am. And I was always adventurous. And I think the original thing that gravitated me towards that was really just wanting to have the most amount of fun and joy that one could possibly have, And when I was really young, I idolized, rock musicians, and I'd only watch MTV, and I kind of saw this like a glamorous, exciting, definitely not boring life. And I could see that substances were involved in that and kind of really enabled that. And, I just didn't want to be bored. And my parents, bless them, they were wonderful parents. And we did get to do lots of family trips, and they got me involved in sports. And there was lots of things we got to do, but they were pretty much like teetotal, didn't drink at all, hadn't smoked weed or anything. And in my eyes as a kid, like, for lack of a better word, maybe just a little bit tame, I'll say. And I was just like, I want more, And so, you meet people, you experiment, and the first time you get high or get drunk, you go, I've found the answer. This feels fucking awesome. And I want to do more of this, And I did. So I suppose that's kind of how it started. I sold all my, I had a paper route from when I was really young till the time I was about, 12 or 13. And it was all the money I made had gone into this bank account that I'd never touched until about this age of 13. And there was a kid that lived down the street from me that was older that had a set of turntables and a mixer and was selling them. And I emptied out my bank account and came home with a DJ setup and was like, I'm going to be a DJ, like a 13-year-old kid.
Yeah.
And, obviously drugs and alcohol facilitated the life of that, or the creativity in that, and just the energy to do it. I mean, if you're going to be responsible for supplying people with a good time at a party, you better be the one having the best time.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I found a lot of success in that. And so it enabled me to do it, and also played into the whole thing. And I was pretty involved in DJing for a good, close to 15 years. And I don't need to go too much into that, but it was a lot of partying.
Yeah. I personally really, really resonated with your story and your authenticity and the way you were sharing in Crux. And for myself, like I've struggled with substance abuse and substance use throughout my life. I'm kind of in the similar boat to you, like had an amazing like family, great parents, very healthy individuals and stuff. And so there was no kind of like traumatic turmoil or something that pushed me or gravitated me towards substance use. It was just I was very exploratory. And, I remember being like 12 years old at like, grade school, smoking cigarettes, on the, and doing odd things like that, and kind of just slowly exploring more. And like, lo and behold, that led to me, dropping out of high school in grade 9 and, abusing a lot of substances like cocaine and ecstasy, and having issues like that for quite a long time. And that continued for quite a number of years. But yeah, so, I definitely resonate a lot with your story. I think that's pretty interesting. And I have a couple of friends as well, too, who have kind of had similar boats like that, of just this interesting exploratory nature and finding something in losing yourself or changing your state of mind,
Absolutely.
Yeah. And also I think the fallacy of like society, you grow up being told like, okay, like drugs are the worst thing ever. Drugs are bad. Drugs are really bad. And obviously drugs are really bad. But then once you eventually try them and you experience some pretty unbelievable things, it's quite an interesting contradiction. Like how did that feel for you growing up?
I mean, there's such a difference. Okay, first of all, I think when you're growing up, yes, you understand social constructs a bit, but you also don't really care about them too much. Or at least if you're a rebellious kid, you're like, well, whatever. Like, it's the same thing as like if a teacher tells you like you should do this, or your parent, and you're going to be like, yeah, well, I'm going to not take that into consideration. And
I think you speak for yourself in that moment. I think there are some kids who are just like, yes, okay, I will do that.
Yeah.
And I think that does come into the personality traits of probably all three of us. You know, I was like that as well. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that caveat in there.
I said if you're a rebellious kid, but yes, you're right. I'm glad you did, and I don't want to speak for everybody on that, but that's how I was, right? And so yes, I could understand, in terms of social responsibilities and being a quote unquote good kid, that doing drugs was bad, but the physiology of my body didn't understand that. You put alcohol in it, you put MDMA in it, and the biology of your body doesn't go, oh, this isn't very good. This is a bad thing. It goes, yes, this feels amazing. So there's the two juxtaposed against each other. And of course, depending on the circle that you run in, you're not necessarily getting the negative feedback, I guess. But you can only ignore it for so long, because I think for some reason there is shame built into it. I mean, you have to lie to your parents. You have to hide it from your teachers because it's bad, in air quotes. And we have this, we have this system that essentially says, how do I say it? I think one of the questions you were going to ask was are drugs bad? And it's well, no, they're not. And they're available everywhere. Most of them are legal, and just a few of them are illegal. And a chemical compound doesn't have a moral responsibility. It's just a set of chemistry. It's not good or bad. It's what happens with it after and how it interacts with a human. That can be negative or positive. I don't even know if I would look at it or good or bad, but
do you remember at a young age, were you cognizant or worried about addiction or harm to your body or any of these types of things, or was that not even a care in the world kind of thing?
I mean, it was, and because my parents were who they were, when they found out that I was smoking weed when I was 14, I got involved immediately in youth rehab, AA meetings. And I could see it. I could see that how much my desire to use and how much I enjoyed it. And also from experience, how much it can sting you. I was concerned.
This kind of brings me, Max, you shared a little bit about your personal experience with this. I too, come from a bit of experience. After the whole dropping out of college, I started smoking weed and then found myself in the giant hole of taking ecstasy probably 3-4 times a week. Just kind of dedicated my life towards partying for probably 2.5 years. Really, really hard for about a year. And you're talking about the sting, and I think that in the beginning there is no sting. It's nothing but euphoria and just exploration and amazingness. And it's not until time takes its toll where you start to experience the dark side of using. My question for you is, how long did that take, and what age were you, and how did that sting first manifest itself?
Well, I mean, it happened pretty quickly. I think the very first time I was exposed to treatment, I was 15 years old. And at that point, I could kind of see that this was going to go to a bad place if I kept doing it. But I was still very green in my use that,
What did you foresee?
It wasn't that serious. Well, it's interesting because if you go to an AA meeting when you're 15, most people are probably familiar. You sit down in the chair and you say, "Hey, my name's Harvey and I'm an alcoholic." So you immediately take on this identity of alcoholic. And I suppose I adopted that view of myself pretty early. Wasn't necessarily ready to give it up, but kind of was like, yeah, I could agree with this. And now I don't know how I feel about that, but it definitely imprinted like a concern and an identity on me. I could say that from that point after, I used a ton, but it was very hard to do it innocently, knowing that there was this relationship that I had with it that was not like, air quotes, normal people, right? And I guess when it really blew up in my face was the first time I OD'd, which was I was 17, I guess, and I had graduated. I had gone back for grade 12 for an extra semester, and it was in between that happening. I was just doing lots of coke and stuff that summer. And one night I did too much alone and had a panic attack in my own house, and my parents found me, and yeah, I had to go to the hospital, the whole deal. And I was in rehab, real rehab, adult rehab, a couple days later. And it was extremely scary,
Yeah, man. Wow. I'm kind of curious, like when you were, so from a young age, you're essentially saying like you were going into AA, right? Like at the time when you were originally going into AA, was that like, my parents just kind of found me smoking weed and, they thought this was the right approach? Or were you actually having like you were really abusing like substances or doing like something, that was really questionable to you? So essentially, like what I'm getting at is like, do you think that some of that was like a self-fulfilling prophecy where it was like you kind of took on this identity as an addict at a very, very young age? Or was it more so like that actually was what was going on?
A little bit of both. That definitely was what was going on. And I think I would have found my way into those rooms regardless. Gotcha. I think finding them at a young age like that too. I mean, I don't know if a 15-year-old kid should be sitting in an AA room, but maybe, I don't know. Maybe that's I shouldn't really say, but
that's a good point. I think, do you think that being there so young was a positive or a negative impact? I kind of feel like, you said like they're like you're identifying with this, I'm an alcoholic. Like I could almost see that as kind of a negative. Like instead of someone talking to you and being like, hey, like you're just having a lot of fun. Like, this is normal, partying's and it's a fun thing, but there are these risks. Like instead it's like you have to sit in this chair and you have to like imprint and identify yourself as this kind of person. Right. And I think as a person so young, I question the ethics and I question the output and the result of that kind of situation.
I'll say this. I mean, it definitely imprinted, especially in those days, that feeling of shame, basically. I mean, even though I don't think there's anything shameful about being in an AA room, and if that helps you, good. It's obviously gotten millions of people sober. But it was this thing of there wasn't the kind of support that was like, sorry if I'm stumbling through this, but I want to
no, it's great.
Really express this. When you're told when you're an experimental kid and maybe you have problems, but you're told like, you're not allowed to be this way and you need to be this way, whether it's intended to shame someone or not, they're going to feel that. Right.
Absolutely, man.
And so I think from that point on, there was shame about who I was and shame about what I liked to do and shame about what I was doing. Even though the support you get in an AA room is wonderful, and but you have this sense of there's something wrong with me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's absolutely a byproduct of the culture we have, right? Of where, to use drugs is shameful. It's something that needs to be hidden. You're talking about yourself as a kid, you got to hide it from your teacher, your parents, all these people. You got to have this behavior. Whereas instead of like being able to speak openly and communicate about your issues and maybe get some guidance, you're just pushing all that stuff down under the rug. There's this societal pressure. I think for myself, like where you were talking about at a young age, I remember my parents finding out I was smoking weed at a really young age, and they were very upset, not happy about that, and drugs are bad and all that kind of thing. And at the time, actually, this was in grade 9 when I dropped out and then went to this kind of alternate school, and I was smoking half a pack a day, smoking copious amounts of weed, and I was walking around school with a cigarette pack that had like tons of ecstasy and a straw to snort ecstasy in it. And meanwhile my parents are going like weed is so bad, you can't smoke weed, this can be a problem, like consequences. Same. We're gonna ground you, and at that instant for me, I just went, okay, cool, well, time to close the fucking vault. Like, we are never ever talking about our drug use, we're never communicating. And like, this was a problem for me, and I wanted to seek guidance. But the culture I was in was like, I can't go talk to my teacher about this. I can't talk to my parents about it. Like the friends that I have that are already doing this stuff, they're in the same boat. They don't know, so, and they're not the people to seek the guidance or mentorship from. So I do think that's a really interesting thing about this, and that's, I think, part of this conversation today is to kind of just, even if it's one drop in the ocean of just breaking down that stigmatization and the bullshit of like not being able to talk about, mental health, not being able to talk about addiction or drug consumption, and the complete hypocrisy of it, obviously. But just back to that aspect of, you go ahead.
Yeah, because you're forced into isolation.
Absolutely. And what's great for dealing with isolation and shame?
Drugs and alcohol.
Absolutely. 100% self-fulfilling prophecy.
Addiction absolutely thrives on isolation.
Yeah.
Right?
100%.
And for me personally, that's where it's been its worst. And if we want to talk later on, what the last year, 2 years or whatever has been like, that's exactly where that monster has thrived.
Oh, we'll get there. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that the isolation, from people who can give you sound advice on kind of like your behavior is tough, because who are you turn to? You turn to your social group, and those people are going to be encouraging you to be doing more drugs. And so it's not like you're isolated from any sort of advice to kind of think outside the box of how else can I live my life? How else do I think about myself? How can I think about, my activities and talk about it to someone who's not sitting there like, hey, do you want a line? Hey, let's do ecstasy tonight. Like, you've got this group that you're with that's encouraging your behavior. And then you've got the group that might be able to provide some sort of healthy feedback towards how you're dealing with your situation. But instead it's a brick wall, because the shame, the isolation, you can't talk to them about it because they just don't understand. So yeah, it's just tough.
And I mean, even devil's advocate, some of your friends could be in that group of shaming, right? They might not be drug users. And hey, my good friend Jack or whatever, he's a great guy. He doesn't use drugs. I wish I could talk to him about this, but he's on the straight and narrow, and I don't want to, be judged or have rumors go around about me, whatever. Insert X kind of problems that you can get going down the line with that, right?
Well, and at least for me, like, and in my formative years and even in my later ones, like, maybe again, it was like the wrong crowd, but I found friendship in these people. I found genuine connection. I found community in these circles. And sure, we were using together, but some of those times were the best times of my life. And
totally.
They were, and they're still my good friends. So it's sort of like to be told in a way like, well, you shouldn't be doing this. It's kind of like, well, but this is my system of support right now. Right. Mm-hmm. Like, and I want to say, like, it's for people that know an addict or know someone that uses or who has that struggle, like it's completely hard on another level for them too. And there's a lot of feelings and fear and care involved, and not everybody knows the right way to handle a crisis or challenge all the time, right? So
totally,
this isn't about saying people need to be better or my teachers or parents needed to be better or anything like that. Like, I think everybody's trying their best with what they know, but I just think that the way we look at it is starting to change. But yeah, I mean, it's still pretty taboo.
Absolutely. And, just to back onto, like, people trying to deal with it their best, I'll just say this is like, my parents were both amazing, loving people, have supported me through and through, like, to the bone. They are amazing. But it was just one of those things where we were a part of a culture. They didn't understand that culture. It was stigmatized. It was taboo. So regardless, sometimes best intentions, unfortunately, aren't enough to get to the root cause of the problem. And the caveat that some problems are genuinely so complex that, even with a team of professionals, it's still going to be a nightmare, so that's just unfortunately the reality that some people face and and some people deal with. Right. So, but I guess for me, just I don't understand how a culture of stigmatizing and shame and pushing things under the rug, promotes a system for anyone. And I'm sure I've heard friends, and I'm sure most people have, who they have, there's people who are like, just say no to drugs and drugs are bad and like no tolerance, drugs, blah, blah, blah. But like, that kind of thinking, I think, is really void of someone who has actually done drugs. I feel like generally the biggest hardliners on drugs tend to be people who don't actually have experience with drugs. Then it's just breeding back to that culture of just, that the individual who is suffering needs support and they need help and they want to communicate about their problems, most likely, or communicate with somebody. And when you do have that culture that is preventing that is stigmatizing that, exactly what you just pointed out, Harvey, I had the exact same experience, going to this alternate school. What happened to me? All of the people who accepted were people who were going through similar issues, who wouldn't pass on judgment to me and who were incredibly inclusive with me and who I had amazing experiences with, and they became my really good friends. But then, of course, you gravitate to a circle of people who are all heavily using and stuff. And once again, back to that kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, that's going to definitely perpetuate a lot more using, right? So, yeah, I don't know. It's interesting.
I think, two points, like to what you were saying. If shame and punishment cured addiction, then nobody would be addicted because it's just loaded with shame and punishment on yourself.
Yeah.
Right. And the reason where my deduction of where that shame comes from is how we learn about love. So we hear this term unconditional love, right? But we're taught conditional love since day one. And maybe I shouldn't generalize, but even down to the simple things. If you do this, you're a good boy. If you do this, you're a bad boy. If you get good grades in school, you're praised. If you are whatever, you're punished in whatever way, right? And that is the definition of conditional love. If you are this, you get love. And if you are this, you get something other than love. Mm-hmm. And so we start to begin to love ourselves that way. I mean, for myself, when I'm being creative and writing songs and I weigh the weight that I think I should be, and I'm sober and I'm climbing and I'm have a cool girlfriend, whatever it is, when I'm killing it, I'm like, I love myself. And then when I'm not doing things right or the way I think I should be doing them, or failing in some sort of way, I take my own love away from myself. So you love yourself on a conditional basis because the world loves you on a conditional basis. If you're doing things that are lovable, you get love. If you're doing things that are difficult to tolerate or difficult to face or challenging or whatever, you don't really get it as much.
No, it's okay. I'm wondering. So you're saying, like, when you're doing all these things that you're air quoting as like societal expectations, the girlfriend, your client, right, you're creating, you're doing art, and then you're kind of alluding to these more problematic situations as using and everything else that kind of comes with that behavior. And you're saying that this removal of self-love, you're almost sounding like it's because of societal pressure that you take that love away from yourself. I'm asking how much of that is actual societal pressure versus you doing something that's not aligned with who you are.
I see. I see. Yeah. I mean, I think the part of societal pressure is sort of like something that's maybe unconsciously learned. And I definitely don't blame society for the times that I've hated myself, and I think you're right that there is the times when I do pull my love away from myself is because I do feel like I've betrayed myself in doing something that I don't believe is in line with my values, and I'll say this, that's been one of the most heartbreaking things about where addiction has taken me, is because I think it's easy to see on the outside and look at somebody and say, well, they don't care. They don't care about themselves. They don't care about their loved ones. But the hardest thing for me about addiction is that I care deeply about my health and well-being and of those around me. And I keep doing this thing that is incomplete, that violates those values. So it's, I think a lot of people with these kind of struggles, and definitely just speaking for myself, I'm a sensitive person, and I have that sensitivity to wanting to be the best I can be and love people the best I can be and really take care of myself. And when you're constantly acting out on behaviors that go against that, it is heartbreaking.
Yeah, truly. And I think that's where the shame and self-deprecation comes in, right?
Yeah, because you're like, man, I'm ruining my life, but like I do love myself. And like if I didn't care, addiction would be a lot easier because I just wouldn't care.
Yeah.
But I care. And so every time I use, it's like,
so
because I care so much.
Yeah. And I think this is interesting. I think that this brings up the question of the monster of addiction itself. And, I've heard people talk about this as like, there's the actual chemical addiction where your body is literally demanding the physical presence of the chemicals that you're trying to ingest. And then there's also the emotional connection, either to the experience, people you're around, or just that euphoria that you get when you are feeling the desire to use. What would you say is the most driving factor? Because, clearly you've been in and out, you've experienced the highs, you've experienced the deep, deep lows, and you have this like consequential information on like, okay, if I do this, I know what's on the other side. Talk to me about the monster of addiction and what goes through your head on those big decision points of choosing to use, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, at different times in my life, it's been different things. as of late, and sort of coming just before the filming of Crux, it was just the feeling of being alone. And I've sort of hinged my life upon sort of what I went back to saying about being a younger kid, wanting to experience the most joy and fun possible. And there's this my brain has become addicted to trying to feel happy all the time, I guess. And over the last couple of years, things have gotten a lot worse because I haven't been as well. Here, let me pause there. The addicted brain is probably one of the most manipulative fucking things that you could ever deal with.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think having a brain and being a human, the brain already is one of the most manipulative things in the universe. And an addicted brain, or especially a brain that's addicted to some of these powerful, powerful drugs that prey and react with the brain's physiology perfectly. I mean, you got a recipe for disaster. I think for me, a lot has happened over the last couple years. Right before we started production of Crux, my partner and I of 4 years, who I absolutely adore, broke up. And that was right when we had won the grant to make the film. And then the pandemic happened. I started having troubles with 4 of my best friends, which ended up not being in my life anymore. And then we filmed this movie, and I had an amazing season with that, climbing and finding all the success, and then following that, my dad passed away in January of 21. And so essentially through this pandemic, there's been 6 of my core, closest, key relationships in my life have gone. And there's quite a lot of grief surrounding that. And without the stability of those things, living alone, that manipulative brain can really prey on that. And luckily, I still do have a lot of friends and a lot of beautiful things going on in my life, but I can't necessarily be involved with them all the time. And when I walk out of the door on Saturday night at work and I don't have a weekend planned, there's my buddy going, "Hey man, I got an idea for you." And, for me, my biggest trigger is actually feeling pretty good. Definitely I've used in all kinds of scenarios, but I'm typically not the kind of person that something bad happens and you go, "Oh, I got to drown my sorrows and block this out." For me, it's almost happiness and feeling good that makes me want to party and feel better. I'll go through my week waking up at 5 a.m, training for a couple hours before work, eating right, getting enough sleep. And after 5 or 6 days of doing that, I feel amazing. And I'm the most optimistic guy in the world. And then I think, the craving comes in. And once that craving comes in at the level that it's at now, it's almost unstoppable. And I'm alone. And so obviously there's huge life consequences to what I'm doing. But the world has shook me so much too, that I'm kind of like, well, what are the real consequences here? I mean, like, nothing makes sense. And I'm going to go home and blow my brains out and listen to records by myself and not think about it. Like, when I say it out loud, it sounds really bad, but it's just become a very simple, easy thing to, well, no, it's not a simple, easy thing to do, because I'm deeply conflicted by it every time it happens. It's a living hell. But
it's habitual, right? It's always, there's the options always on the table, which is hard.
Yeah. Well, exactly. And it's unfortunately, I'll be honest, unfortunately, I've become addicted to a method, like a new drug and a new method of using it, which is smoking crack, that is just so much more powerful than alcohol or MDMA or snorting cocaine ever was. And the way that I got addicted to that was at the most vulnerable time in my life and the most lonely time in my life. This opportunity walked in front of me where I was able to, it was introduced to me with a supply and bang, right? And it's one of the most addictive things you could possibly do. And so it is, yeah.
How's the come down?
I don't know where I was going with that, but
how's the come down?
I mean, it's horrible.
Horrible.
Like and especially at this point, because I feel like I know better, and it's not what I want to be doing with my life. And I'm deeply, deeply, deeply conflicted with it. Yeah. I care about my mom. I care about my friends. I care about my job. I care about myself. I care about wanting to be able to climb in beautiful places. I care about not overdosing and dying on the fucking street. Like, I care about my mental health. And you do the drugs and have the effect, and then when they go away, the reality of how much you care comes back, but it comes back in a way that's just like very hard, because you feel, horrible. And you can see the damage you're doing, and you can feel it. And you don't know what to do about it, because you don't even know how you got yourself there. All you knew was like, it was a good day, and you were like, yeah, maybe I'll just go get a couple beers. And then, 3 days later, all your money's gone, and you've been locked inside your house smoking coke all night, and you're like, fuck.
I think that's a really interesting point you just brought up. And I know for myself, I went through a period of my life where I had a really big problem with the consumption of cocaine, and it was always predicated by the consumption of alcohol. Like, if I was sober, I was good. I was no problem. Like, I wouldn't, go do blow or anything like that. But the second you got like 4 to 6 beers in me, it was like, okay, 5 a.m. in the morning, and you're calling the drug dealer, and you've consumed like 30 beers, and you can't even believe it. And it's like the 100th time that you've done this, right? And I think that's a really interesting point that just you brought up that I wanted to ask you about, is like, how much of your drug use is actually predicated by alcohol consumption. And then also just, it's really, we can get into this a little later, but obviously the cruel irony of the pharmaceutical industry and the way that we have set up our culture is that, alcohol, one of the most powerful substances on the planet, that you can literally annihilate yourself into oblivion, legal, totally everywhere, most amount of deaths worldwide, most amount of accidents worldwide. It's like arguably the worst, most powerful substance. Buy it on the street corner, absolutely anywhere, no problem, not stigmatized in our culture, no issues. But then you just kind of turn the eye to some other illegal substance, and there's this weird perception that like for some reason, like you're just gonna, smoke crack or do a line of blow or whatever and go kill somebody or whatever. And it's like, I just don't understand the argument of that. So that's a little bit of a rant, but generally just back to the question of how much of your consumption is actually predicated by the consumption of alcohol.
100% of it. I mean, alcohol has always been my drug of choice, and I've done lots of drugs, and it always has been. I will say that since smoking crack was introduced to my life, it's a little bit switched, but they go hand in hand. And so there's this, I continue to be, it sounds really dumb because I clearly have had numerous rock bottoms and points of, I'm highly aware that I can't have alcohol in my body or drugs in my body because it's just not going to be okay. And if it is okay, it's like, well, you got very lucky tonight. So I know this, but there's still this, and maybe this is the manipulative part of it. There still feels like this innocence about it where I'm a guy that likes to have a good time, and I'm walking out of the house on a sunny day and I'm like, man, just want to have a couple beers on the beach right now. But as soon as that enters my body, it's like, all right, here we go. And with the addictive nature of these other things, I mean, you will spend all of your money. You will, there's a reason why there's downtown East Side in Vancouver. And there's a reason why this addiction to these drugs, like you're quintessential what you see. It's because they are very powerful. And so you were speaking, you asked me about the come down. And one of the things that I wanted to say was, I mean, the thing that I've learned about all that is how to go through an extremely difficult come down and actually walk myself through it with some compassion rather than all of that shame. Because the shame comes up, but it's happened so many times that I've had to learn to hold my own hand and love myself through that too. It goes back to the thing of like loving yourself is easy when you're not coming down and a drug addict, but loving yourself is really hard when you're an addict and you've just spent all your money and you don't have any food in your house and your friends hate you, right? So It's almost like a life lesson in a sense of, well, if you really want to learn how to love, you got to do it when it's the hardest, because love isn't just a affectionate feeling towards something that's pleasant and nice. It's the real raw tolerance to hold space for some of the gnarliest stuff you'll ever see or go through, and hold it in that space of love and allow it to be there so that you can transform it. That's kind of how I look at it now, because for me, the only way through this is to love myself through it.
Yeah. I think just for anybody listening, I'm just wondering, I know what my opinion is of this. But I think when people think of like drug addiction and relapsing or, coming down, and they really think of these like physical sickness and attribution. But I think maybe I'm just projecting this, but if I was to guess, a lot of people don't understand that, at least in my opinion, to my estimation, the self-deprecation and the self-loathing and the just utter hatred and shame you have for yourself when you have relapsed is far worse than the physical feeling you are going through. It's like psychologically unbearable to the point of like thinking of self-harm and craziness. And so, when you're talking about kind of loving yourself through this process and accepting, and, and that ties into just removing the stigmatization about these things, not only loving yourself when you are making those decisions that are valued by society, learning to love your flaws as well too, right? And that's a really difficult thing to do. But yeah, back to that openness, that inclusivity, that reducing of shame. I just don't think a lot of people really understand that like people who use drugs, who've told themselves for the 100th, millionth time, whatever, waking up and having to go through that process, that, it's very myopic to just view drugs as this like, oh, it's bad for your body and all the withdrawal must be bad, or the sickness you get the next morning. It's I think it pales in comparison to the psychological deprivation that people go through.
Yeah.
Well, I think that the psychological deprivation is also attached to the come down. I think your brain is not high on dopamine or the norepinephrine. Like your brain is literally starving from these chemicals that make you feel good. Like love releases norepinephrine, it releases dopamine, it releases serotonin. Like there are other ways to get these chemicals in your body, and that's what makes us feel good. And drugs flood our body with that. We don't have it anymore. Our brain is starving, and so it exacerbates this problem of self-loathing and misery. And so, it's really hard to be positive in these moments. And it's not just this physical feeling of, oh, he's coming down on drugs. It's like there's this mental turmoil and strife that happens in your brain when you're low on those kind of chemicals, and it's fucked. I've been coming down on drugs before and just been sitting on the couch, just like not only in physical pain, but just like hating myself. And it's horrible. It's really hard to come back from. Okay. So my question is, these chemicals in our brain that we're suffering from the lack thereof when we're coming down on drugs and experiencing euphoria with the flooding of these chemicals. Climbing, in my experience, is a source of that flood. It is a source of norepinephrine. It's a flood of adrenaline. When you succeed through a run out, you get past a sketchy spot, you're flooded with dopamine. Like there is these sources for a high that I think that, people like us who enjoy these euphoric moments through drugs, there is a bit of a chemical addiction, but there's also the experience and the feeling that we have after these moments. And climbing gives that to us. And Harvey, I think you experienced this firsthand, before the filming of Crux. This was like a big transformative part of your life. And I think a lot of the ways people can remove themselves from these kind of bad habits of addiction is replacement therapy. Replacing your habits of what you do with your time with other activities that don't allow that behavior. And climbing, yes, I find is such a perfect outlet for that, because you can't be high on crack and climb a climb safely. It's impossible. And you might not be as high as you would on crack as if you're in a crack climbing, but there is a little bit of a parallel. And my question to you is, you did find that switch, you did find that parallel, and you explored it for a long time. Are you climbing now? And why do you, it seems like climbing is no longer that kind of replacement therapy for you. Why do you feel like that is the case at this point in your life?
Well, I am climbing now, and it absolutely is what you just said it is. Last year it wasn't. When we filmed Crux in the summer of 2020, I had the most amazing climbing season I've ever had in my life. And that was literally, 3 months out of one of the darkest relapses I've ever been through. I was standing on top of granite towers in the Bugaboos. Like the transition, the 180 was night and day. Following that, when the season ended, I did kind of come down from the mountain per se. And I was kind of thrust back into pandemic, back into being alone, not having climbing as an outlet, death of a parent, and spiraled right back into that place. And last summer, I probably only went climbing a couple times just because I wasn't really able to get myself together enough to do it. I had gained a lot of weight. I wasn't mentally there, physically there. I'd gone climbing a couple times, and rather than it being kind of fun, it felt fucking traumatic. Like it was scary, and climbing is always scary, but it was like, I don't want to be here kind of scary. Like, but I've been slowly kind of walking myself back. And I think one of the reasons why things are still not where I want them to be, but they're a bit better now, is you said something about basically participating in your life in a way that doesn't allow you to act out on those behaviors. And that's exactly what it is. I'm working a full-time job now. I haven't got to climb outside because my days off have been rainy and my days on have been sunny, and it's been an exceptionally wet spring here in British Columbia. But I've been training a ton indoors. I feel mentally way stronger, physically way stronger, and I am stoked to go climbing as much as I can this summer. I know it's not going to solve everything, and I found that out kind of through the making of this film, but it does provide a space for me. Well, I mean, let's just talk about self-esteem. I mean, when you can go out there and climb, at least, even if you're failing and falling off a thing like over and over again, the fact that you're out there doing something, interacting with your body, with nature, with people, is so good for one's self-esteem. And having some high self-esteem is got to be one of the number one things to number one antidotes to something like addiction. Because addiction, using drugs by yourself alone without being connected to people, is totally low self-esteem stuff. So that's a key component. And yeah, no, I have big plans for climbing.
That's super awesome, man.
It seems like it's a transfer of addiction rather than a removal of addiction. It's like being addicted to one thing. It's like, what can I be addicted to that's not self-deprecating? Do you feel like that's true?
I've heard this sort of cliche, I guess, of switching one addiction
it's probably
for the other.
It's probably super cliche.
And like, well, you're just addicted to climbing now, and it's a healthy addiction. But I think the very definition of addiction doesn't involve health. The very idea of addiction is any type of behavior that is causing harm in your life that you can't cease, that you can't stop doing. Now, maybe climbing could be looked at as an addiction if you're, blowing off your work and it's causing you financial trouble, or you're an absentee parent, or whatever the thing is. You got to climb so much that it's hurting your life in other ways. Yeah, that would be an addiction. But in terms of just really loving an activity and wanting to do it all the time, I wouldn't call it, I wouldn't classify it.
I appreciate that delineation. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So Harvey, it sounds like, I think an interesting topic here, kind of what you are talking about though a bit, is, the harm reduction versus abstinence, so our culture dealing with addiction for a really long time has been really focused on just purely abstinence, right? It's like, you're either an addict or you're not, you're either sober or you're not. Is kind of these these binaries, right? So I'm wondering what your relationship with that is now, and how that maybe has evolved over time.
I love this question, and yeah, it is very binary, and there is the sort of, most of the way we look at addiction comes from the 12 steps of AA, which was kind of a program that was invented nearly 100 years ago. That is, without getting too far into it, in a nutshell, once you're an addict, you're always an addict. And addiction is a incurable disease, but it can be treated, and it can be treated with programs and abstinence. But yeah, sober or you're not. And of course, I had kind of adopted that mentality just because that was the education I was given. which makes relapse really hard. I mean, if you're 3 years sober and you go out and have a drink with your friends or one night out, next day you're 1 day sober.
And you got to live that every day, right?
Yeah. And so I think the abstinence harm reduction thing is sort of a case by case basis and an individual basis. And one of the things I'm grateful for, though, even though I haven't necessarily been succeeding at it, abstinence is my goal, and still is. But I suppose abstinence just hasn't been a reality for me. And so it's harm reduction in the direction of abstinence, you know? And that kind of goes back to my way of learning to give myself compassion. It's like, if you can't be sober every day, if you can be sober most days and try to do damage control when you're not, and be honest about it, have conversations with people about it, not hide it, try not to be ashamed about it, show up as a fucking whole human being that's going through the struggle just like anyone else. You know, that's, I think, the path through it, than sort of this, I'm this or I'm that. I don't know if I agree with the, well, again, and I don't think it can be for everybody. I think probably in my life, the chances of me succeeding in drinking or doing coke again recreationally are probably zero, without it having a detrimental effect on my life. But for other people, maybe they go through a phase where they're abusing it, and then they can still go have beers with their friends after some months or years of abstinence. Whatever, good for them.
Yeah, there's nuance. You know? Everybody's different. Everybody's brain's different. Their chemical dependence, you know, their situations. I do think that, like, I think that, you know, AA has obviously done a lot of good and is such a successful thing. And for anybody who uses that, you know, power to you. I think it offers a great support group. I don't think it's based in, like, you know, like you said, it's 100 years ago. It's not based in like modern scientific literature of like how to cope with addiction and stuff. So the reality of it is, like, if it works for you, great, do it. But let's not like view this from a cultural aspect of like, this is the only thing, you know, you're either sober or you're an addict and you got to go to AA, and that's the only way to deal with it. Is like, we're really diverging from that, I think, from a scientific approach to addiction, you know.
Yeah. We're also forcing people into that isolation situation with that mentality as well, because, you know, it's either abstinence or not. Like the second you make that decision, it's like, okay, now I got to hide myself. Now I got to live in shame and deal with this. And that's not going to make the situation any more bearable for the person trying to go through it in the first place.
Which is exactly what I started doing. I mean, when I first started to drink again after basically 4 years of sobriety, I had done that publicly in an environment that, whatever, I don't need to get in why, but that was quote unquote safe and agreeable, let's say. But after that, all of the using I did was by myself, because I was Harvey, who was 4 years sober. Yeah. And I couldn't tell people that I was drinking because it was like, I felt total shame about it. So and then it fed on each other. And then the beautiful pandemic happened where I was alone anyway and totally enabled. I'm not trying to make excuses for myself, but enabled to be alone all the time. And, you know, and so, you're exactly right.
Out of curiosity, do you have any like positive relationships with drugs? Yeah.
Psychedelics. Yeah. I've done plant medicine ceremonies with ayahuasca, which have been incredibly transformative. That was something I was practicing with when I was in those years of sobriety.
Would you say it helped your sobriety? So before, just beyond being transformative and eye-opening, like, did it actually help? It helped you stay sober, right?
100%.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's a common thing to hear from people.
And, I've recreationally used LSD and mushrooms and stuff like that. And those have never been something where you're like in the middle of a mushroom trip and you're like, yeah, let's go do more mushrooms right now. Yeah.
You're good. We're cool. Like,
yeah. You're like, I think I'm good for a while.
Talking yourself down in the corner.
Yeah. And so again, not for everybody, but I think there needs to be more objective research that goes into those things, because I think those drugs, if you even want to call them that, can be definitely more on the healing side of things than the destructive side of things.
Totally. We just did a podcast episode with a personal trainer and a health coach who uses psilocybin as a microdosing medium for his clients. And we had a whole talk about the positive benefits of plant medicine. It was a really good conversation, and we're definitely on that vibe. I've had multiple transformative moments and psychedelic experiences, just expanding my mind and thinking about the world in different ways.
Yeah, and I think really back to that kind of binary and harm reduction versus abstinence. Like, for myself, like, I had an issue with certain things, and like one of them, I'm kind of like, even if I thought I could touch that again, I just don't, because it was such an issue for me. And then like my relationship with alcohol was incredibly poor. Like, just, I could not stop binge drinking way too much for quite a variety of years. And then I kind of found like climbing, athletics, my mother passed away, a whole bunch of stuff happened. And I kind of, have kind of come back, and I'm now like totally able to just casually drink, just relax. You know what I mean? So I do think, just for anybody listening, it's like, don't pigeonhole your, not that I'm promoting if you have a substance use issue with something to like go use that substance, but it's like viewing things in those binaries, like you say, can actually be really harmful in some ways if, maybe harm reduction is actually something that's just way, way better for you as an individual, right? So I think that's something interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you've talked quite a bit about like, COVID and mental health, and I definitely have some opinions on the topic here, but I'd really love to get your take on potentially maybe like, maybe give us like, I think you've already done it, like a little bit of what your lockdown experience was and that isolation and how that isolation can affect people who are vulnerable in certain ways. Right. And so I'm wondering maybe, what is your opinion of those policies that kind of force people into those isolations? Did you view them as like a necessity, or, are you really angry about them?
I'm not angry about them. And I don't know if I'm really able to speak to whether those policies should or shouldn't have been in place. I'll say this, that I think what happened, I think even the doctors, the politicians, the people in the government, nobody knew what the fuck to do. And I like to think they were all really just trying to do their best, and those were all hard decisions to make. And so I look at it as just a really unfortunate thing that happened, that got dealt with it, how it got dealt with and how it could have been dealt with doesn't matter, because we're here today now, and it would be nice if we could walk through life and avoid, avoid trauma, but you can't. If you're in a human's body, there's probably something there that hurts still, or that's undealt with, or that has forced you into a dark place, But I think the thing is moving through that as a collective, with that unconditional love, with that allowance for it to be how it is, with a way to like, in order to have hope, you kind of have to know what hopelessness feels like. in order to be brave, you have to know what terror it feels like. Without one, you don't really have the other. And I don't mean to minimize it, but that's just the way life is. And I think the less that we can resist that and kind of really hold each other through that reality, which is a terrifying, upsetting, inconvenient reality.
Yeah, totally.
You know?
Yeah.
And we all need that support, whether you're an addict or not or whatever. You know, we all have our own level of suffering that we have to endure as people on this planet.
In these moments of suffering, especially the darkest moments when you're extremely isolated, how would you see someone trying to support you? What would be the best way that someone could come and help you? From your perspective, what what does that support look like to you?
You know, I've had that support from the people that are in my life now who have taught me what unconditional love really is. And that's allowed me to kind of, I guess, try to treat myself that way. And really, again, it's allowing me to be going through my suffering, how I'm going through it, like, and not necessarily condoning it or giving me a free pass, but also like not needing it to go away for, you know, like, and just, I think, well, yeah, I think one of the things that could help me the most is that my friends do what they need to do to take care of themselves as well, so that they can hold the space for what I'm going through. Because yes, I can have help, but really the only one that can bring me through what I'm going through is me. Mm-hmm. And I need community for that, but I also need to, be allowed to go through it. And so in terms of relationships, if that means one of my friends or loved ones has to set a boundary with me or whatever, that's okay. But try to set a boundary with as much kindness and tolerance as possible. And it's better for everybody.
Space without judgment.
Exactly. That's what I wanted to say. The only kind of support I need is not to be judged. You don't even have to be involved in the process if you don't want to be. Just don't judge me for something I already heinously judge myself for. And
I think that can be hard for people. Like you said, I think that if some people need to set boundaries, and I think that's important that you respect that, because some people, the behaviors that some of us choose to do is just not aligned with some people's lifestyle, and it can affect them too much.
Absolutely.
And I think
you can set a boundary without being
hateful or judgmental. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Sorry, kind of jumping in on you there, but we're saying
totally.
The same thing.
And I think that's the thing. It's just like you can let someone go through. And that's the hard thing too, though, because, if someone does care about you, giving them space almost seems like you're letting them down. It seems like you're allowing them to do this kind of like a negative behavior that's clearly, doing these poor things to their lives. And I think it's definitely hard for someone that tries to really be there for someone to not be there for them. And in that, in by their lack of presence being there for them, it's like this weird kind of situation.
It's not easy. I mean, I feel for my friends deeply that have watched me go through this, and when things got really dark, like I tried to commit suicide a month after Crux finished being filmed.
Wow.
And got very close to that happening. And I am so grateful it didn't happen. And it was really a miracle what actually went down. But you know,
did you save yourself?
I'll say this.
Go ahead.
A pedestrian did.
Wow.
I call him lifeguard Steve. And he's in my phone. Hey, Steve.
Nice.
You know, I'll say I definitely didn't make this choice because I didn't think people cared about me, or because I, you know, felt alone even. It was just a dark moment that I couldn't bear, and I thought that it was going to be my only way out. And what hit me after that was the reality, you know, and it ended up being very public. And I realized after that the reality of what it would have felt like for people to just receive that news, you know, like, oh, what?
Yeah.
He's, you know, and how that still to this day, I'm sure there's people that maybe aren't in my life or aren't as close, because that was something that was unbearable to think about. And for a minute, it could have been real, you know? So yeah, for anybody out there that's trying to support someone with depression, addiction,
yeah,
it's very hard. It's hard for everybody. But again, I think we can do the best we can do when we're doing it. And whatever that is okay. It kind of goes back to being like, well, should have done this, or should there have been a lot, you know, who knows?
Yeah.
Try to bring as much kindness into your own life so that you can bring it into others. And for me, if there's any value to the suffering I've been through, it's that hopefully it allows me to hold space for that in other people with less judgment and, you know, whatever, and be there to help, whether that help is just being there to witness someone's humanity without having to feel in control over it or responsible for it. I mean, it is a mystery why we're even here and why we all go through what we go through.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, just really heavy, definitely a lot. I'm wondering, like, you know, through that process of like when you were, you know, when you like were thinking about taking your own life, like what was something that like you've done since then to like kind of help you get through that? Like, are there any, you know, tips or tricks? That's a weird way to put it, but like, what do you do in some of your darkest moments to essentially cope with your reality and to help yourself through those dark times?
I mean, I think getting to that point and then not having it happen was very scary, and really brought the idea home that, wow, it doesn't matter how hard things are, my life is so valuable. And it doesn't matter if I'm sober or if I can't get off the couch or whatever. If I never climb a rock again or do something amazing, my life as a human has monumental value. My value is not based on my performance or my sobriety or anything. It's there because I'm alive. And I believe that's really true for everybody. I try to connect with that. And also know that my suffering isn't the end of the story. You know, it's there and it may go away and it may come back again, but it's not the end of the story. And that just because, and I mean this personally, because I don't claim to project this onto anybody else's life and what they're going through. And I would never wish suffering on someone else or say that, well, your suffering is there for a reason kind of thing, because we endure these horrible things that I guess we shouldn't. But for me personally, knowing that feeling pain doesn't necessarily mean that something is wrong with me. You know, hurting, or we'll use that word suffering again, doesn't mean that I've done something wrong. That's just a more loving way to look at it than being like the other, right? I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know how to finish that
it is
sentence.
a human
but
condition. And I think that it does give us, we have to, like you mentioned before, we have to experience it to enjoy happiness, because I think that this ideological utopia of human existence that some people paint, of everyone feeling happy all the time, no one ever suffering, I'm not sure if that, one, could ever exist, and two, I think that happiness loses its value if you don't have the other side. And I think it's
I mean, whether we have to go through it or not, we're going to anyway, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's gonna happen.
I mean, no need to feel guilt or shame about feeling down or feeling depressed or all of those kind of negative emotions that we go through, however they're caused in our life. I think that guilt and shame should never be associated with that.
Yeah, and another key thing is to not feel guilt and shame about feeling guilt and shame, right?
Yeah.
Like, if you know you feel shame, don't shame yourself for being ashamed. Of course you're ashamed. You're a fucking human. Yeah. You're gonna feel shame, right? Yeah. Like, and so when the shame wizard comes up, it's like, here's shame again, and I try to say that's okay too. Like, by denying yourself of shame, you're almost gaslighting yourself by being like, don't feel shame. Yeah. Make the shame go away. It's like, well, no, you feel shame.
Yeah.
You don't have to feel shame, but if it's there, there's something that's being called up,
Yeah.
And I think the more that we can show up with shame, show up with vulnerability, show up with joy, show up with struggle, show up with chaos, show up with whatever it is. It just brings, those are all parts of humanity. And the thing that make a human whole are all of those things.
Yeah, I think it's very true. Yeah. And I mean, you have been so authentically transparent, just not only through this podcast, but through your film Crux. And, it seems silly, but it is something that I admire. And I think that I hold true to myself too, is trying to be as transparent and open as possible. And it begs a question, like, is it messed up that we're like praising people for this, or is it a good thing? I think that, we should be encouraging this kind of behavior of being transparent and being open. I guess it's just more of a sad statement about where we are in society right now, because, we're like praising these people that are coming through so transparent, but that's kind of where we should all be at in the first place.
Yeah, it's true. It's, I'm very grateful for the way I've been received, for the vulnerability that I guess I've shown up with. But yeah, I'm not doing anything special. I'm just being me. Mm-hmm. Messy old, fucked up, trying to have a good time, good-hearted Harvey, right? Yeah. Like, I've been lucky to more or less been surrounded by people in my life that have made me feel okay to be who I am. I mean, at times, of course, I've been denied of that, but I don't think maliciously. And so I think that's what's responsible for my vulnerability. I don't think everybody has that, right? Like, a lot of people, I don't think a lot of people have a space to show up like that, right? And that is kind of sad. And that's what we're here to change with this movie and with this interview, I think, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
It is interesting getting praise for something that's just real.
I think beyond it just being real, it's like, you know, I feel I've had tons of experiences like this. Anecdotally, I know people, you guys can speak for yourself, but the amount of people I know who have like stigmatized drugs or who would or do stigmatize drugs, and yet like they go down to the bar, they have some drinks, they smoke their cigarettes, they have caffeine, they'd get like, you know, amphetamines prescribed to them from a doctor to like study harder, or like, you know, insert like X things. It's like, you know, drugs are a massive part of our culture, our societies. Drugs are incredibly beneficial in so many ways. And for a lot of people, you know, they don't actually suffer from addiction, and it brings them lots of joy and happiness. And if that's the case for that, then, you know, good for you. But I do just think of those that stigmatization in society of only certain drugs, you know what I mean? And that's something that's really, really interesting and kind of just such a tragedy. And I don't know. Yeah. For you guys, I don't know if you experienced the same thing with that, but,
I mean, I would go as far to make a bold statement here that says that everybody is addicted in some form of another. And it goes back to having that definition of there's something that you do that you know isn't good for you, or that you shouldn't do, or that at times you don't want to do. But
yeah, I think in the DSM-5, it's anything that
totally.
And it's hard to change, whether it's shopping, fast food, chocolate bars, cocaine, booze, work, dieting, whatever.
Food's another one. I didn't even think of that.
Yeah,
I think it, and this is another maybe a little bit of a wormhole, but it's an interesting modern take on what addiction is. And we've been told that addiction is a disease. We kind of talked about that earlier. And I think the intention with the disease model is to destigmatize it. So it's like, well, someone has this disease, they can't help it. And although well-intended, the definition of a disease is if you have an organ that's malfunctioning, basically. If you have heart disease, you have a heart that is not working the way that a heart is supposed to work. Well, the way the brain works is every behavior we learn is learned through reward systems, from learning how to not put your hand into a fire to anything. It's learned through these reward systems. You take an activity like drugs or alcohol or sugar or any of these things that are highly rewarding to the brain learns that reward and it wants to do it again. So in that sense, it's not the brain that the brain's actually working in a way that it's intended to learn. There's nothing malfunctioning about the brain except that the brain isn't designed to work in the social arena where, it's not okay to just be loading it with dopamine all the time. But to the brain, it's just like, well, this is a highly, so I
think that a lot of the, sorry, go ahead, cutting you off.
It becomes a highly learned and very hard to break habit, but maybe not a disease. That's up for, but that's just some of the new research, which I think is interesting.
I think that the big difference is just short-term reward versus long-term reward. And I think that a lot of these kind of bad habits or addiction is used as a connotation, a bad term. And I think that it means short-term rewards, long-term negatives. That could be said about sugar, could be said about overeating, cigarettes, whatever. These all things have this immediate reward. And with overuse and abuse, they have this long-term deficit that starts to manifest itself into your life. And I think that it's interesting that our brain has a really, really hard time learning and thinking long-term rather than thinking right now. It's not in our biological process, because when we were back in the caveman days, we're like, I need food now. I eat, I kill this deer. I eat now. Like, I want to have sex. I'm going to go have sex right now. Like, it's all this like immediate things. And like, we weren't living in this world where these long-term things where we have access to these things day after day after day, where we can actually build this long-term negative effect from these short-term benefits. And I think our biological mental processes haven't caught up to the amount of access that we have to these things. And we're dealing with it as a population.
Yeah, for sure.
Totally.
Harvey, I'm just wondering, like, what's your opinion on like, drug legalization, safe injection sites, drug testing, those kind of things and those kind of policies?
Well, it's interesting. That's why are some drugs allowed and others not? And some of the ones that kill the most amount of people are the ones that are legal, you know? And it's funny, by making something, I mean, the essence that I feel like the stigma in addiction to, let's call them illegal drugs, is born out of the fact that they're illegal almost. As soon as you take using drugs and turn it into a criminal activity, well, then you don't just have someone addicted to a thing that's addictive. Yeah. You have a criminal. Yeah. Now, do I think that you should be able to buy a gram of Coke at a cocaine dispensary? Like, I don't know. I don't really want to speak to that, but I for sure think the decriminalization of things is a yes. And yes, in Vancouver, there's a huge problem with opiates and stuff on the downtown east side. And I don't know, like, this is really hard to say, but I feel like no matter how much support some of these people get, I mean, I believe that there's hope for anybody and transformation is possible. But with the way that the system works, the chances or reality of some of these people getting completely free of their substance is next to none. And even if they did, with the damage that's happened, being able to participate in the world as anybody who hasn't been down there, again, like,
hard to reassimilate.
I feel horrible saying it, but probably pretty unlikely.
Yeah.
And so this has become the life that they have. And they're being denied the access to at least a safe drug that's not completely full of garbage and danger and, all this stuff for what? Like just someone's moral decision that
they're going to do it anyway.
So safe supply, I think.
Yeah.
Probably a good thing. Safe injection sites for sure.
Yeah.
Do you think I mean, even if we tried it, what's the worst that could really happen? I mean, the real pandemic is. Well, I
think two things. One, statistically, the most harmful substance on the planet is alcohol, and we completely know this. So I feel like the fallacy of like, if opioids were illegal, like it'd be like anarchy or chaos, or so many more people would be addicted and dying. I personally don't believe that. I think that the vast majority of drug users are, non-addicted recreational individuals on the globe. I think we hyper focus on addiction, and rightfully so, because it's such a huge issue, and it's, the most visual, I don't want to use the word problem, but it's the most visual thing in our culture and our society, So yeah, I personally am a big believer in thinking that, decriminalization, taxation, legalization, safe injection sites, not stigmatizing these things, and providing people an avenue to do that. And, I don't really, I use like drugs recreationally, like, some marijuana, I use kratom, mushrooms, like these things. But I don't really use like the drugs that I used to, have quite an issue with. But, when I did use those drugs, there was no like, oh, it's illegal, so it was hard to get that drug or something. Like, it's like I had like 10 numbers in my phone. Any day of night, I can call somebody. There's a guy who's just driving around the city 24/7. So the whole idea of like drug access and like, oh, if there was a corner store that you had to go get a prescription from your doctor to get a certain amount of cocaine or something, and then you could go to that dispensary and it registered the amount and you got a clean supply. That's actually harder to get, in my opinion, than right now. You just call a dude, he's going to be at your house in 45 minutes. So I think there's this weird fallacy with that like it's going to increase drug consumption. And I don't know. I don't really get where that comes from personally. So, and I just think back to my comment is it's really easy to hyper focus on these things of just like, we do view the extremes, like 2-3 standard deviations, from the mean, like the outliers essentially. Right. And I think back to it, it's like, I just had a surgery. I spent 2 days on, morphine, hydromorphine, and fentanyl. Then I spent another 2 days after in the hospital getting juiced really hard. And then I got like 20 days of, morphine at my house mixed with a whole bunch of other painkillers. And you know what? Like, I just completely stopped right after that. So there's like, I feel like a fallacy that like, you just, you try, an opioid once and you're just like smack addicted. You try cocaine once, you're smack addicted. It's like, for people who actually have had a relationship with drugs, like that's in my opinion, at least, that's not how that happens. Like once you do get to a point where chemical dependency and these issues are there and you are really addicted to a substance, you got a really big problem. And I'm not advocating that people toy the line to get to those areas at all. But I do think back to that destigmatization is like, we need to recognize that there's a lot, like I think the global drug trade's like $300 billion a year.
Yeah.
That's not $300 billion coming from addicted people who are impoverished on the street that can't afford drugs. Like there's a lot of people using drugs who are not addicted that are just, get on with their life and they're totally fine. And if you can do that, like I referenced this guy, Carl Hart, where he talks about, drug use for grownups. And he essentially says, like, if you're an adult, you got your shit together, you're being responsible, you're being healthy, and you can recreationally use a substance, why does it matter if your substance of choice was having 2 drinks at the bar, or you really like to just take like an opioid pill and relax at your house, right? So for me, I don't see the distinction there, and I don't think one is worse than the other. I just think that once you get to the extreme end of the spectrum, which is we can call addiction, that's when you have a problem, regardless of the substance, because, back to that, alcohol's at the corner. I can walk down 3 feet from my house right now and I can go buy a single bottle of alcohol that can kill me.
Because substance doesn't cause addiction. Drugs aren't responsible for the addiction. Circumstance, trauma, whatever it is, big or small, is the addiction. This is why what you just said is true. Why some people can do cocaine on the weekends and it doesn't affect their life, and other people, it absolutely destroys them. So it's not the drug that is the addictive thing. It's the complex set of everything inside a human that is the addiction.
Circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was so excited to say that. I was like, he's saying exactly what I want to say.
I was really interested on what your take with that was, right?
Yeah.
And I think back to what you just said, like I think this is back to Carl Hart again, this guy. He said that he worked in a heroin clinic in Europe where they administered like heroin to people in a very respectful way. These were fully functioning, great, responsible individuals who did heroin twice a day administered in this clinic, and their lives were totally together, no problem. And he kind of talks about how they were also studying, I believe, that like schizophrenic patients were having really, really good results with using, and I'm, by the way, not advocating this for anybody, go do your own research, but they were having really, really positive results self-medicating with like opioids, and that a lot of medication for like schizophrenia and stuff is unbelievably powerful and harmful and like really, really hard side effects, and back to those people on the downtown east side you're talking about, it's like you got this disenfranchised, abused individual with completely hurt, mental issues, all these other things, it's, to say that like, oh, it's the opioid that addicted that person. it's like, man, come on. This guy's got like, without drugs, A to Z, 90 problems that you can't even, visualize or understand about, that are almost impossible to fix. And he's totally suffering. And, back to that, bringing it back to the beginning of social isolation, confusion, lack of love, lack of compassion. You're alone. What's a great thing to do in that circumstance? Drugs and alcohol, So yeah, it's crazy. But I was really interested to get your take on that, Yeah.
Oh, all right.
Took the words out of his mouth.
Yeah, man.
Woo.
Wow.
Really?
I think that's I mean, I got a couple more questions for you, Harvey, unless, man. Kyle, you got a lot more. I got, I think like,
all right.
I think.
No, I'm
I think we can end
here,
like on a little bit of a happier note.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
Let's do some climate questions here, right? So, Harvey, I guess just kind of cliche here, but like, what does climbing mean to you, and why did you choose climbing? Like, what was that video that inspired you?
Climbing chose me, man.
I love it.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been inspired by the outdoors and loved mountains. Adventure has been something. I'm an adventurous dude. We know that now.
Yeah.
The seeing these people have this experience that just seemed like one of the most incredible things one could experience on Earth, And I just thought, that's what I need. And it's funny because originally it was just like, I was watching mountaineering films and stuff like that, because rock climbing actually seemed way too crazy. I was like, there's ropes, steep cliffs. I was like, mountaineering just kind of looks like extreme hiking. And I was like, an old, like, out of shape DJ could do that. Like, I never thought rock climbing was actually going to be possible. I thought the rock climbing was the more extreme sport. Obviously, we know it's kind of the opposite. Alpinism is way, way crazier. And I found that out the hard way. And I remember seeing Valley Uprising and just really drawn to the culture and the history and these interesting characters that, kind of looked like rock stars from the 80s. And and then when I started doing it, well, I mean, I got into it pretty fast. I got into trad climbing within the first 6 months, and my first climbing trip was down to Smith Rock after climbing in the gym for about 4 or 5 months, and started leading right away with bolts that were 10 meters off the ground and not knowing what I was doing. And I remember some friends took me on a multi-pitch, and wherever I may roam, it's like a 6-pitch 5.9. And I remember just doing the first multi-pitch and getting, 3-4 pitches up and just being like, wow, this is the coolest thing in the world. I, just want to do this all the time. And then doing it more, like it gave my body a purpose, like to be able to use it to be somewhere cool and share it with somebody. Like it, all of a sudden there was a reason for my body existing other than just being a container for drugs and alcohol.
Yeah.
And more importantly, the thing that I love about it still today is, after hearing me speak for the last couple hours, you can kind of tell that I have a hard time being responsible or making responsible decisions a lot of the time, thinking into the future kind of stuff. But when I tie into a rope, I'm the most responsible being ever. I'm that person that I want to be. I can make concise, thoughtful decisions about my life and my partner and act in a way that emulates a person that not emulates, but is embodied by a person that cares about their life and their existence in a really fucking passionate way. And so as much as I feel like I'm out of control or not responsible, when I'm climbing, I am those things. And that's really empowering. That's why it's such a good thing for my life. And I think the desire to keep doing it, it helps me clean up my life, you know, when I'm not at the crag.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, man.
Yeah, totally.
Super well said, man. Definitely resonate with that a lot. I think that climbing forces us into the present more than anything else does, probably just as well as drugs do. I mean, at least for me, when I tie in and I take the first couple steps into a climb, I am just right there, super present. Nothing else matters. Every decision is calculated, and there is just nothing else in my life, and it seems like yours as well, that meets that same level of presentness and intensity. It's just it's amazing.
I think last thing for me here is what's in store for Harvey, man. What's getting you excited right now? What's motivating you for the future?
You know, I'm happy to see where it goes. Like, I'm terrified and full of doubt and curiosity and excitement. But, I mean, some of my life goals, I'd love to climb in Patagonia one day. In terms of short-term stuff, like I said, I didn't really climb a lot last year, and I'm just stoked for this summer to go and kind of repeat a bunch of the classics in the Squamish area, whether it's 5-7 or anything, and just kind of go and rediscover this thing that is my source of healing, and rediscover it with old friends and new, and just continue to be myself and be around people that are sharing that experience too. Yeah. I gotta keep climbing.
Yeah.
Just keep climbing.
Yeah. Climbing's the way.
Yeah, I mean, the crux for me is how to stay connected when I'm not tied into a rope. And I'm figuring out how to do that. One thing that comes to mind is, not to bring it back to shame and stuff, but when you go through relapses, especially after making a film about how climbing saved your life and how it got you sober and then you're not sober, it's really easy to look at your relapses and say, man, I'm doing a really terrible job having all these relapses. But the way I try to look at it now is, man, I'm doing a really good job surviving all these relapses.
Yeah, totally.
Totally, man. Just that simple perspective flip is kind of like, and it doesn't absolve me of changing my behaviors, but it says like you're doing your best, man, and keep going.
Absolutely, man.
Doesn't matter how shitty it gets, keep going. It's worth it.
I'm a big believer in visual cues and visual reminders. I have like my cam just like sitting there. I have my gear wall is literally in my fucking dining room.
Me too.
It's not in my garage. It's like it takes up my entire living space. And it's just like I love having that reminder every day. It's just like come downstairs and you look at it, it's like, all right. Just keep the vision in mind.
Yeah.
It's really, really good. Really healthy.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think for me, that's everything as well too. So, for anybody listening, the film is Crux. Definitely check that out. Go give it a watch. And Harvey, you're on Instagram, right?
Yeah. It's just my name twice at Harvey.
There we go. Harvey on Instagram, and we'll put links to the film and to Harvey's Instagram and everything in the description. So Harvey, man, it's been an absolute pleasure, talking to you. And I think our little drop in the ocean of reducing, the stigmatization of, drug use. Hopefully we've done some small part. And thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us, man.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
And I'm excited to get on a rope with you.
Hell yeah, brother.
Okay, man.
Awesome, Harvey. Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. I super appreciate it. It was just an awesome time talking to you, and looking forward to when our voices cross again.
Thank you all.
Yeah, man. Take care, buddy.
See ya.